Welcome to Lesson 2 of my Django for Beginners series. The next thing I like to do in a project is sort of get my settings and everything set up all nice and good. So I have the settings file open here, and I'm just going to walk through some of the important parts of it, make a little bit of room here. So there's some stuff, just some constants, and this is basically like a way to get the base directory, which is just basically a reference to this part of my file system. Nothing we ever have to change there. We have a secure key, secret key rather, and it sort of randomly makes you a key when you do this, but I do recommend, in locally, it's totally fine. Keep this as is. Don't even worry about it. But when you do go to production, you're going to want a new secret key that you generate that is, completely random. And this is used for a lot of any of the cryptography part of Django and signing tokens and stuff like that. And it's just a way to make your application, much more secure than if they didn't have something like this. Debug is a way that you get cool debugging errors and stuff. Something that you definitely want on locally when you're building, because you'll get a lot better errors and messaging and logs. But it's something you definitely want to have off in production for two reasons. One, you might be exposing some vulnerable data when you have it to true about your application. And secondly, the debug mode actually slows a lot of things down because it's doing a lot of extra things to provide the developer a better experience. It's something that you'll have off in production. Allowed hosts, this is something you can configure what hosts can actually run this. So for instance, like we're going to want to run this on our, on our local host. When we have this up on the server, we might have, a specific domain that we want to allow it to run on. So it's just a security feature so that people can't just kind of like run your code base, somewhere that's not supposed to run. Then we have the installed apps section, and you'll see it's already filled with a few Django.contrib apps. So these are different apps like for the admin, for authentication, for sessions, for dealing with static files. This is a place in the future you will add potentially some third-party packages to tell Django, hey, you're going to use this, as well as our own apps that we'll be making. Middleware is essentially kind of like the pipeline of every request will go through all of these in this order. So things like the security stuff that Django has built in, stuff for clickjacking and so on and so forth. And this is also a place where we may install some of our own middleware at some point, as well as certain packages require you to include it. Maybe it's a logging package and it just wants to kind of intercept the data in between. So again, won't be doing a lot in this section except when needed, but I just kind of want to explain what it is. This just points to our root URLs, which we haven't really talked about URLs yet, but essentially our main URLs right now, we only have the URLs for admin, but we're making other things in here, maybe URLs for API, maybe something for like a user profile, so on and so forth. So this is like our root URLs, and of course, this is pointing to actually, if we click on it, it goes to this whole like different file that's part of the Django contrib package, and it has its own sort of like sub URLs. But what's cool is we could decide to actually change this if we didn't want to use admin. And in fact, I actually like using the word manage here as an example. So I'm going to make that change right there. And we'll be, instead of logging in right now through the admin, so if I actually go back here and refresh, I'm going to get a 404 error. It's like can't find, but if I change this to manage, now I have it. I just like the word manage. It's kind of managing the data, that kind of thing. You could call it whatever you want. It's also a way that you could, in theory, completely remove the admin, and that's usually a common practice in certain environments. On your production site, maybe you don't use the admin at all, and you don't want people like even trying to get into it. So you could just totally, remove it. And if I actually went now, it's just not going to get me there. It's bringing me to the sort of this like 404 page. This is like the built-in like not found page when you're in the development server. All right, so that's just pointing really to this file. Then we have some stuff for templates, and when we get to templates, this will make a lot more sense. But essentially, it's saying what backend to use, and we're going to be using the Django templates backend. It's a great, system for making templates. It also allows us to say to point to some other directories that aren't like generally following the Django convention. If we have appdir's true, it means it's going to look for templates within our app folders that we haven't made yet, but it allows us to put templates that are specific to that app, and it will know where to find them. And then we have our different options, which is something you might need to configure, but this will work for now. And it also has this kind of like the middleware from a templating point of view, allowing like debugging and the request stuff and auth and messages and stuff like that. And it might be, depending on if you're installing a third-party package, there might be some instructions in the docs, hey, add something else here, and this is where you would do it. We also have a link to, hey, where's the WSGI application? And it's in project.wsgi.application. So it's just pointing there. You could, put this in a totally different folder. As long as you update your settings, it'll work totally fine. Okay, then we already looked at this, our database configuration. So it's saying where we want our database and what backend we're using. We'll be making some changes to this in the future when we add Postgres. We have some stuff for auth password validators, just using some of the built-in ones to make sure that, this one I think is like, make sure the username isn't the same as the password. There's like a minimum length validator. You could make your own, you could install packages and reference them, but these are the built-in ones. If you didn't want any password validation, you could just remove these fully and, you could probably make a password that's just blank and it would probably work. I haven't tried that, nor do I recommend getting rid of these because it's a good thing to have. We have some stuff for internationalization, and this file has some nice links to the docs. So if you wanted to know what other settings you could put that are relevant to internationalization, you could just open this up by holding Command and clicking. We have stuff for static files. So any of our static files, which could be like CSS, JavaScript, images even, this is the URL it will live in. So if we actually had static files, it'd be something like, /8000/static/ test.css or something. That doesn't exist because I just made it up, but it'll basically live in that URL. And if for some reason you wanted to call it assets or call it, files, or call it just S to make your URL shorter, this is where you would change that. And then there's just something for what's the auto field. So our auto field is what is used as your primary key when you are creating data. So just to kind of show you what I mean, let's go back to the admin, which if I refresh should have here. And what we'll actually see here is if we look at the URL here, which I know is probably a bit small, I don't know if I can make it bigger, you'll see there's a 1 here, and that's actually the primary key of this user. If we made another user, it would be 2, the next one would be 3, that kind of thing. It's saying we're going to use this model for that, which is basically like an integer field of auto incrementing numbers, except it's big, meaning it can actually go above, the integers have a max size, basically a max number. I forget the number off the top of my head, but they use this because it actually allows for much larger sizes. Again, something you probably will never actually need to change because this works totally fine. So that's the settings file in a nutshell, the basic settings. And it's a place where we can add more things for sure. Now, something I like to do is just because coming to this file and finding everything in the right place and everything can get a little bit difficult. And what's cool about Python projects in general is we can actually break this into multiple files. So I'm going to show you how to do that now. We're going to go into our project folder and we're going to make a new folder just called settings. And inside here, we're going to add a init.py. Now, the reason you need a init.py is it tells Python that this is a Python module, meaning it's something you can access sort of like with this dot notation. If we didn't have that init.py, you wouldn't be able to actually kind of go like django.contrib.admin. It wouldn't know where it is. So we do that and it makes it a Python module. Now inside here, what I'm going to do is also make something, just to sort of show this out, I'm going to make something called database.py. And what I'm going to do is actually take my database code configuration. I'm going to grab all of it, including the comment, and I'm going to put it in here. And I'm also just going to copy this just for now. I'm just kind of like showing this as an example of how we could break it up. There is a better way to do this, and of course I probably chose the wrong thing to do an example for because it has a few other things. This will get all cleaned up shortly, but what we can actually have is our database there, and I can actually go and take all my settings. So I have my settings here. I'm going to move this into the settings folder, And I'm going to, for now, just call this miscellaneous. And in my init.py, which usually is just an empty file, but you can do cool things in here. I can actually kind of import some packages. And to do that, I would just go from dot, because I want to sort of do something in the current directory. And then I do misc for now, import star. This will import everything from there. Similarly, I'm going to go from dot database import star. Okay, so we'll save all that. And basically what's going to happen is we no longer have the settings file here, but it's going to find the settings module without us changing any code about it. And it's going to look at this init.py, and it's actually going to load all the things that are spread between these files. So if I actually restart the server now, make run, and I realize, so because we moved the database, the SQLite database, it's actually going to make a new, it's making the file in the wrong spot. It's going back a directory. So we actually are going to make a slight modification to that so that we're not keeping this in here. Oh, you know why? It's because base directory is using this. So we actually want to go .parent. And this is just because I'm kind of explaining this just really as an example. So let me delete that file that it made. And it was simply just made it because it was referencing the wrong base DIR. And now we see we're not getting that migration issue. And everything will work just the same. I'm still logged in. You know, I still have everything working. So this is just a nice thing you could do. It's definitely optional. You could keep everything in each file. But essentially what I'm getting at is, you know, I like to kind of break it up where I have, you know, all my my secret key in a certain file, anything to do with debugging, installed apps in a file, middleware, that kind of thing. And it's something I'm going to do off camera, and I'll walk you through it in a moment. But I don't want to waste time just kind of doing this like tedious thing that's boring. I'd rather just kind of show you. But it's a great practice, and it's just nice to do sort of at the start of the project. Just makes it easy to do things. And then when you, for instance, add a new feature that has a whole new thing, like maybe logging or something, you know, API keys for Amazon, S3 buckets, like for your media, you can kind of make a new settings file and keep everything really compartmentalized there. So let me just take care of that, and I'll walk you through how I did it. This is, you know, entirely optional. If you want to just keep everything in one file, it's a totally normal thing to do. And you know, I'm not going to judge you for it. All right, so I've just taken the time to kind of break these up in a way that I like it. Again, optional. But basically what I've done is in my init.py, these are all the different files that are now in this folder: access, apps, auth, all that kind of stuff. And if we look at any of them in particular, you'll see they're very compartmentalized to the things that have to do with this. So this is everything to do with access, you know, allowed host, something called maintenance mode that is not being used right now, but is definitely a handy thing that we'll get to. We have all of our apps just in here. We have stuff like our, you know, debug. So the files are just simpler and easier when you want to make a change instead of going to that file. And trust me, on a big project, that settings file will get quite large. So keeping it this way is really nice. Now, the next thing we want to look at is how do we essentially set our settings up in a good way that will support multiple environments. So right now, the problem would be if I tried to deploy this, or maybe I share it with you know, another developer and they need to have slightly different tweaks, we're going to have to be changing the code all the time. And in a traditional like VPS sort of server, that would mean, okay, I got to deploy the code, then I got to quickly go in and actually edit, you know, where the database is, for an example, or change debug mode to false and restart the server and do all these things. We definitely don't want to be doing that. Essentially, throughout this course, really, we're going to be following something called the 12-factor app. So this is just a really great sort of like overview of the things you should be doing in terms of your code base, in terms of dependency and config and so on and so forth to build a really well scalable and secure application. And this was created by one of the, I think the CTO or one of the founders of Heroku, which is a really great platform that's been around for a long time now for hosting containerized applications, including Django and other things. So if you looked at the config one, and I do recommend, like, you know, if you're really interested, although I'll be touching on hopefully all these things, you know, read through this. It's not that long. You know, there's 12 different pages kind of like this. And it sort of explains, you know, all these things and the reasons behind it more than anything. So Basically, what I think is the best process for this is to use environment variables, and that's just the common practice to use. And basically, what an environment variable is it's something when you're starting your application, it's sort of like a variable that sort of exists globally on your system, or at least in the context of your application, that isn't part of your code. It's instead, on sort of stored in text on your system, and it's secure because unless someone has access to that server, they're not going to be able to find out what it is or modify it. And of course, if they have access to your system, you have bigger problems anyways. And that's all in good and fine to use. However, from a local point of view, working that way and actually like making sure those environment variables are set, especially if you're not using something like Docker, can be a bit cumbersome. And when you want to context switch to another project, which might be the case, you might have old environment variables. So what we're going to do is we are going to create a new file called .env. Okay, and this is where we're going to put various settings. So I'm going to start with just one of them, and we'll have debug. And we're going to say debug equals true, just like this. Now, in order to support this, we do need to do a couple of things under the hood. First, we need to install a package. The package is called Django-Environ, and we can install it simply by following this right here. I'll copy this to my clipboard. Pip install Django Environ, and make sure my venv is activated. Otherwise, you'll be installing this to your main system, which is not what we want. And we'll see it go. It went and it found, the latest version that is compatible with our environment, meaning, it's not conflicting with something in Django, it's not conflicting in our current Python version. And we can see successfully installed this. We can also just do a pip freeze to ensure, it's there. And then, like I said in the last video, we want to take this because we did manually install it, and we want to make sure we put this in our requirements. So I just paste it in like that. And it's basically saying the name of the package and then specifically this version. And that's the one we want to use because we know it's compatible, everything installed, we're good. Okay, so now that we have that, we are going to set up a couple of cool things. So first of all, one of the settings files I made was called environment. And right now, this is just getting our base path, and it's also setting something called environment variable, which is going to be something we're going to make configurable because you might have a dev, a staging, a QA, a prod environment, et cetera, et cetera. And for, maybe for logging purposes or, many other reasons, it's something that's nice to have. So inside here, actually, I don't need this import. So what we're going to do is we're going to import Environ. Right here, and that's the package we just installed. Now it's not called Django Environ, it's actually just called Environ, but you'll see when we install Django Environ, we actually, one of its dependencies is this. So we're importing Environ. Then what I want to do is essentially, and I'll do this even before the base directory, we're going to create something called env. So this constant called env, which we just go environ.env, and this is all found in the docs. I'm not, making this up. You could follow this through to see how to do it. Importing this stuff, environ, whatever. So we're instantiating this sort of like global class that our settings will be able to access. Then what we need to do is we need to point it to this file to say, hey, use this as a default if it exists, because the plan is here locally we're going to have this file. On our server, we're not actually going to have this file. We're going to be setting, when we get to deployments, we're going to be setting the environment variables through like a secret manager and sort of stuff, which will actually add them right to the root. But this becomes kind of like the place where it's going to read stuff from. So in order to do that, we are going to, I realized why I had OS here because I had plans. We're going to have to import OS, and this is just a root Python package. It's for the operating system, stuff to do with the operating system, reading files, that kind of thing. And we're going to make a reference to something called env path, and we're going to go os.path.join, and we essentially want to join our base directory and then the .env. So this will look for a file inside the base directory called env. The reason this join is really nice is we could have just written this out, by kind of like concatenating the string together, plus, this .env, that kind of thing. And this would have worked fine in our environment. However, on Windows, directory for some reason are backwards, or at least backwards from my point of view. You'd have problems. You'd have to detect, is it Windows, do this. And the path.join automatically takes care of that for us. So really you just pass this in. And when you're using path.join, you can also, go deeper and be like this file inside this folder, but we only need the one right in the base directory. So it's really simple. So we're making this, and this will just be a string now of where to look for that. And we want to check if that file exists. So if we go out os.path.exists, and we can check env path, the variable we just made. And if it exists, then we go env, basically this thing that we just made, and we want to say .read environment, and here we pass in env path. So only if the file exists, it will do this. And running this is basically what will load all the environment variables in there. So now, because we've only set one, let's deal with that one first. So remember, we have debug equals true. So now I'm going to go to the debug one, and instead of just setting it to true, we're going to go from .environment, so our own file, and I should have had a dot here, from .environment, so it's in the same directory, so we use that dot, import env like this. So we're basically importing this variable right here, and then instead of just saying true, we can go env .bool, because we know this is going to be something that's going to be a Boolean. It's either true or it's false. And what we will do is actually pass in that name. So what do we call it? Well, and you could call it whatever you want, but it's definitely a good convention to keep these names the same, because otherwise you'll be like, okay, I called it debug here, but then it was called debug1 here, and it just gets confusing. Keep it the same. And what we can also do is set a default. So if we didn't include that, we can actually say, by default, we want it to be false. If we forgot to set debug, we always want to make sure it's false. So it's kind of like, set it to the production version, essentially, as your default, and then this allows us to override it in this file. So let's just see if all this is working. So I'm going to go Python manage.py run server, and we see everything's good so far, at least. And let's go back to our, let's just go right to the root. And interesting, we have an error here. Okay, let's look into what this could be. So it turns out I just made a silly error. I forgot in here to include URLs. I had everything else, I'm pretty sure, and I guess I didn't test it. My bad. But when I was doing that, it wasn't finding a root URL, so everything was going. But fixing that, we now get this. So now let's stop our server, and let's go to our env file. So just this, text file here, and let's make it false. And we'll restart it. Now here I'm getting this error. So I know something's working. You must set settings allowed hosts if debug is false. So for this case, I'm going to go to my access, because that's where it is, and I'm going to make sure that I have, for now, 127.0.0.1 as an allowed host. I believe that is what I need to do here. And then, yeah, we don't have the error anymore. So one cool thing about when you have debug mode off, it's kind of like, has a bit of extra security, right? It's saying, no, you have to have this set, we want to protect you. So now if I go like this, I get this not found. And this is just simply like, instead of using the debug, that fun page that it was showing me, or, if I try to go to a URL that doesn't exist, instead of getting that 404 page, I get just this generic error that's not really telling, an end user coming to this what the problem is, which is, ideal, because just as an example, let me put debug mode back to true. And I'm going to show you one thing. So I'm going to change it to true. I'm going to refresh. Nothing's going to change because these files only get read. This file only gets read on starting of the server. So I have to actually stop it and restart it. There we go. So when I don't have debug mode, I'm getting a bunch of, information here. Like an end user can be like, oh, first of all, someone will know, oh, it's built in Django. Okay, cool. Like, and that's something you might not want to necessarily just tell people, because if for some reason they know conventions in Django, like, oh, it's probably it's /admin. And in fact, I'm telling you what the URL is. So there's just a lot of data you don't really want to leak in a production environment. And that's, a reason to definitely have debug to false in, in your real environments, as well as the other things mentioned earlier. Okay, so we can kind of do this same pattern for a few other things. So I'm not going to do everything right now, just because that would be a waste of time, but let me think of a good one. We're not going to go over the database. This will be something we come back to when we get Docker going. But let's do something with our environment, actually. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to put this actually underneath this because we need to make sure we read this first. Otherwise, it won't know what to do. So we can do the same kind of thing. We can do env dot, in this case, I want to read a string, and we'll call it environment. So I'll be looking for something called environment. And by default, we're just going to make it say unset, just to kind of, if we end up using this, we'll know what mistake we made. And then, again, in our env, we can also do environment equals, and in this case, dev. So I'll save that, and I'll save that. And if we actually restart our server, and we'll do a full restart because we changed something in here, we'll be using that. And just to kind of show this, because, we don't really have a place, I can actually print environment. So let's actually print it, and we'll see that dev came up here. Whereas, if we, for instance, didn't actually include this here and restarted, we should see unset. So there it is, unset right there. So let's keep that. So yeah, in the future, we'll be adding more things to here, especially when we get to actually using Docker and having, databases. Another thing you obviously would want to put in here is maybe like a secret. So let's just do that real quick. Let's do secret key equals, and I'm just going to go to wherever I put the security. This is in security. So I'm just going to grab this one. Seems fine to me. And we're going to go secret key and just put it there. Then we need to, in this file, go from dot environment import env. And here, instead of actually having this hard coded, we would go env dot string. And I'm going to use basically the same thing, secret key. So this, making these match is just good practice, but it has to match this one. Otherwise it won't, it just won't work. So let's just do that. And now I want to show, I didn't set a default here. And this is actually good practice for certain things that you really want to require and not have in your code. So secret key is a great example for this. And if, for instance, I decided to take this out and actually restart my server, I'm going to get this error basically saying, set the secret key environment variable. So sometimes you don't want to have a default. And I'd say this is a very good example of when you don't, because then, if you forget to configure it and someone has access to your code, they would know your secret key, which, can be a problem. So we're not going to have a fallback. It's just going to basically completely do a runtime error right on startup. So we'll never expose that. And that basically covers everything I want to talk about environment setup. So to end on a more fun note, let's actually start an app. So an app in Django is sort of like we sort of kind of have one app right now. It's our project app where we have, various things in it. But we're going to create a new app now. And this app is going to be called content. And it's going to have to do with all of our sort of like core content of our application. Again, you can call this whatever you want. I do generally have a content app in all my Django projects, assuming there's some kind of content involved, which is usually the case. Now to do this, we simply run python manage.py start app and then give it an app name. So I'm going to call it content. And I see the word dev is being printed, and that's simply because in our, I think it was in environment, we have this print. So I'm just going to remove that because it's kind of annoying. And you'll see a new app got made, content. So here, within here, I'm going to walk you through sort of the different files. So we have an init.py, which is actually just an empty init.py, but it's just marking that this is a module, meaning we can import things by going content.admin.whatever, content.models, that kind of thing. So we have that, just saying it's a Python module. There's an admin.py, and this is where we'll register anything we want to show up in the admin, which we'll get to at some point. Our apps.py, this is kind of like the file that sort of does the initial bootstrapping of the app. It says what field to use for your auto field, and also gives it a name. Generally, we won't be touching this file until we get to things like async and celery, where we'll want to configure a couple things in here. Models.py, this is this is probably the core of your project, of the app itself, and this is where we're going to be defining our models in the next video. And that's everything that has to do with what's going to be stored in our database. Tests, this is where we will write unit tests. Unit tests are basically a way we can write automated functions that will run when we're that we can run on a whim or run when we're deploying, that will kind of check to make sure everything's working and there's not like a breaking change. There'll be a full tutorial on that later in this video, I think probably right near the end, testing. And lastly, we have views. And if we're making, an application that has, our typical, web pages and HTML and stuff like that, this is a file that we would be doing that code in. So kind of just, set these things up for us. It's just really a boilerplate, but it is, a good start. There's also a migrations folder, and you'll see in here it's empty except for the init.py, again, just marking it as a Python module. And when we are working with models, this will make more sense and we'll touch on it, but the file's there, it's ready to go. Okay, so we have that app. Now, the last thing we have to do when we make a new app is tell Django that this app is an app we want to use, not just a random folder, within our project. And to do that, we'll open up our settings file. So if you didn't follow along with the actual breaking these up, this would just be found in your settings.py installed apps. But if you did break everything up, you'll want to go to your apps.py or whatever you called it. And here we just go content, so the name of the app, apps.content config. So it's basically lowercase name of our app, then .apps.content config. And really what this is saying is go into this folder, content, go into this file, apps, and give me the content config, which is just this auto-generated sort of like boilerplate code. And just doing that will actually mean that the app's installed. And if we actually run the server again, assuming we don't get any errors, we know, okay, stuff is good. All right, so we have that bootstrapped ready to go. And in the next video, the next lesson, we will actually start building some stuff within this app. See you there.